this computer. Yep. Then what we're going to do is I need to share my screen, which is on my screen now, but not after I share it, which is what I'm learning. All right, can you see the slide, Gail? Yes, all right. Well, everyone, welcome to Book Club Bible Study. We're doing this sort of jointly. Sorry about last week. We attempted to record and things went technologically sideways for us. So hopefully what's being recorded is this slide, not me right here, or at least maybe it's both of us. Who knows? We'll see later when we look at the recording. So I'm sorry if you do not see a slide, but we mostly have folks here both online and in person. Before we get rolling today, is there any big questions that jumped out to you that are from last time that you want to make sure we cover?
What was why you did the Egyptians not
like in the grand scheme?
Yeah, well, not in the grand scheme, but just at that point.
What? Well, you would have had, I mean, where do you get the idea that they don't like them?
They were during when they visited the family, Joseph's family was there, and Joseph was.
Oh, they're not eating with? Is that
yeah,
what? Okay, absolutely.
They didn't like them.
Okay.
They didn't like them.
Okay, so what it was is the Egyptians. Okay, so the Egyptians are organizing themselves into an ancient version of a nation state or kingdom. Okay, they're not quite there, but you have a pharaoh who we would probably look at this point not as a king, but as sort of a strong man.
Okay.
But you do have independent ownership of like family ancestral lands still going on. So he doesn't own all the land yet.
Okay.
Okay, but he's rich, he's powerful, he commands an army. So you have this very uneasy sort of government, non-government. So people are mostly governed by their tribal governments, which is mostly traditionally driven. Okay, but you also have this pharaoh who has military forces and power and money and bureaucracy. That are sort of uneasily living with each other at this point. Okay, part of what we're going to learn about today is how you go from this uneasy competition between sort of local chieftains and this inset of what's going to become a kingdom to why the kingdom actually forms. Which, by the way, matches history pretty closely on this one, at least insofar as the economic driver that has Egypt really become one of the first kingdoms that we know of historically. Because the pharaoh is going to be able to consolidate power. Now, Genesis points that, by the way, to Joseph's help. Okay, which may be one of the reasons, if you forward into the future, why you see a real dislike. And that's why I asked the question, was it current or future in the story? Because when you get to the book of Exodus, they will have enslaved the Israelites because they grew jealous and hated them. Is sort of the answer given by Exodus. And so one of the explanations may have been that if you look at the end of Genesis, Joseph helps essentially enslave the Egyptians to the pharaoh by reducing them to sort of sharecroppers.
Right.
And so sort of a turnaround, and we don't really know, and obviously history is never that precise when you're this far back, but the sort of guess would be that at some point the pharaoh sells them down the road and say, you're right, these guys really did mess you over. You know what, I should enslave them too. And then I'm in control of everybody. Right? I mean, we can totally see how like a strong man would be like, you're absolutely right. The only answer is I have complete power. Okay. And sell them down. He does. And not only does he have the Egyptians' land, but they are now required to give him 1/5 of the money or the crop that they're producing. And so you're really starting what we would look at as sort of like an early proto-feudalism setup. Except for, unlike feudalism, you don't have like a intermediary prince or duke or baron like you do in medieval feudalism. You really have the pharaoh, his folks, his army, or hers, because some of them are female, it's worth noting. And then everyone who owes sort of money back or something back to the Pharaoh. But this gives them a real advantage. Now, even during this period of time, the Egyptians would have looked at the Canaanites and the Israelites, who are essentially disorganized tribal family units, more like clans than even tribes at this point, and would have sort of looked down at them as primitive. So to answer your question, the reason that the Egyptians wouldn't have eaten with them is they sort of looked at the Israelites and Canaanites and anyone from the whole region as savages. Again, maybe the way like a European during the colonial time would have looked at First Nations folks.
Okay.
So I don't know what to describe that as. Hate is a word that seems reasonable to me, but any other questions? Great question. All right, do you want me to just launch on in and if you guys come up with any? All right, so 45 to 50, we are finishing the book of Genesis, which means when we get done with this class, you all owe yourselves a round of applause because you will have finished the entire book of Bible. And well, that doesn't probably seem like all that much because you're like, oh my goodness, I completed that much. There's this much here. Realize you have probably completed more than 90% of Christians. Okay, because sadly enough, I bet you if I gave people a quiz on Genesis, it would be bad. As in, if I gave them 10 seconds to find the book of Genesis, I could keep it pretty easy. There is no test, do not worry. I did not want to start a rumor. No test, folks. But be thinking about what book you want to take on next, okay? Because that will be a question come late summer I will approach you all with, okay? All right, so book club Bible study, here we go. We're going to start right in. Chapter 45, it's worth noting the brothers are scared to death. So they still think like, oh man, my comeuppance are coming, okay? So they are not trusting Joseph when Joseph says, hey, it's okay, I love you guys. They're thinking he's going to hug them and stab them in the back, okay? Which, if you've met this family, that seems like a very reasonable fear, okay? But that lack of trust, that lack of belief that things will be okay, that continuous suspicion of one's brother, of one's family, is also continuing to lead to constant conflict. Okay, we've seen that sort of lack of willingness to believe that they've been forgiven as part of the problem. Now we start in a concept here, it's barely touched upon, in which they talk about the idea that God saves this group of brothers because he's going to use them as a remnant. Okay, because you're going to have this mass starvation, lots of folks are going to die, and he rescues the family as a remnant. It is worth noting this is one of the huge dynamics that we see throughout the Old Testament and then referenced a lot in the New Testament. Okay, and it gets more and more defined as you go forward. Okay, so right now it's not very defined, it's just noted. But one of the things that you see as you would to go really into the prophets. Okay, so if you were to continue reading Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, you'd see it more and more and more, but it really comes out in the prophets, in which you see as part of sort of history of God's people, that you will have a period of time where God is talking and people are listening and doing. And from that time of faithfulness, as God leads them along, things will get better, okay? Because God wants good for us, okay? Then people will get, you will get usually again, once you get the prophets, you're talking generations because we're talking histories here, okay? You'll get a generation that will be like, things are so good, I don't need to listen to God anymore. And they'll stop listening to God. Now, usually nothing bad happens to that generation, okay? Which is one of the reasons Deuteronomy, I would say, gets it wrong. Because Deuteronomy tries to assign this idea that bad people have bad things and good people have good things. And that's not really what the prophets are happening. Because what will happen is you get this generation that stops listening to God, but nothing necessarily immediately bad happens, because all those structures, all those institutions, all those things and morals and ideals sort of survive, right? Because morals, ideals, structures, institutions have a certain level of resilience. Okay. And you can exploit them for a while before they collapse. Okay. And so you'll have like a generation or two that is wicked. And then those institutions, whether or not again, depending on the type, the religious institutions or the civil institutions will begin collapsing. Okay. And then something bad will happen. They will get captured and sent to Babylon, or another nation will conquer them, or something bad occurs. Okay. Then what happens is during that time of whatever the bad thing is occurring, some remnant turns back to God, usually not most. And from that, you get a generation that says, we need to get back to doing what works. We need to get back to treating each other correctly. We need to get back. And usually the prophet would come at this point, okay? So Jeremiah says, you guys have been treating the poor horribly. God does not want you to treat the poor this way. And things are not going to get better until you start treating the poor like they're humans. Okay? And so eventually someone says, you know what we should do is you should treat poor people like they're humans. And then because that is a good thing, not just for the poor, but for also the people who then see all humans as human, which is part of what makes us spiritually whole. Because when we don't see everyone as human, we lack our own spiritual wholeness. It also helps hold society together, right? Because if you cast any group of society out and say, well, you're not really human, or you're not as human as I am, you're going to break society apart. Okay. You have things start to get better. Now, it does not get better immediately. Usually the remnant goes through all sorts of pain. Okay. But from that, a new cycle starts. Things swing back up, usually with a whole slew of reforms. So it isn't so much going backwards to what was, it's going, what was had this flaw. We're going to fix the flaw, and then all the bad things that occurred from this flaw. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a generation or two in some version of a golden age, until you have another generation go, well, everything's so good and so easy, I can just sit back and do nothing. And you repeat the cycle. However, that cycle always has you eventually getting a little bit better and a little bit higher. And I would argue that that cycle, well, you see that easily in the Bible, again, particularly in the Old Testament. We see that in the world, which is why nations come and nations fall. It's why, you have this, but you still, if you were to map out the general projection of the entire world, it is this sort of progression towards getting better. Okay. Now, any region or area or people or nation can go backwards, but if we're talking the whole world, I think you can argue through history that the world gets slowly better, but often gets better by a lot of pain. A good example, one of my favorite groups out there is Horrible Histories. They're a completely nerdy group of British folks turned Canadian, because they got into trouble with the British Parliament. Long story there. Okay, but they used to be BBC, switched over to CBC, CBB, whatever, the Canadian Broadcasting Agency. They do kids stuff, but they do history stuff. And and you can go ahead, go to YouTube, go Google it, Magna Carta. And it was a celebration commissioned by the Queen, because the Queen liked them, celebrating the Magna Carta when it hit its whatever 500 years or whatever it was thing. And it was a whole history of how the ideals of the Magna Carta came about, and then how that moves all the way to the modern day UN, and how it affected Thomas Jefferson, and how it affected all these things. And they sort of show it, and it's just sort of a cute, funky kids musical song looking at the Magna Carta and the ideals of it. But I step back from a theological standpoint and say, those ideals are good, right? Humans are created equal, the ideas of individual rights, the idea that, tyranny is not a good thing, right? Those are the ideals of Magna Carta. you have these different conflicts, like the American Revolution, that you have people literally going and looking at the Magna Carta and saying, these are great ideas, let's expand, right? And then you have groups looking at the US Constitution and going, these are amazing ideas, can we expand it? And so you have that sort of movement through time. And so I say, like, as Christians, one of the things we always have hope in is when we hit bad times, when things are hard, when things feel like they're falling apart, we can have hope in a way that others can't. Because we can look at history and say, God is working. And it is often from the darkest hours of human history that some of the most beautiful things eventually come out. Okay, and we can see that, like, we can say, you know, what was going on in World War I is a whole bunch of old power structures, like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, were inward collapsing, and eventually they were going to go to war to try to keep it. And what did World War I do? It really ended the idea of monarchs as sovereign world powers. Okay, and you can point to these different moments in time and sort of say, you know what, before this, you had that, after this, you don't really have that again. And well, it might try to reassert itself from time to time and never reasserts itself ever to that level. Okay, so there's something to think about as sort of a way in which we can derive hope from a story like this. Absolutely, that he is taking one aspect of that. So he would absolutely agree. Like, he would, what that's called is, and the word is dated now, okay? It's called a progressive theologian. Now, when we hear progressive, we think of like politics, but that's not how it was used in the 60s. Progressive merely meant that God progresses time, as in God moves time and moves through time. Okay, so it had no necessary political implications, which is why I don't like using the word, because again, everyone hears it the wrong way. But I would call myself the same idea. So I would say that God moves things through time, and one of the reasons being faithful to God is so important is because if you are listening, God is always calling, and when we participate, things get done, or at least done faster. And that is how we participate in the bringing of God's kingdom, in bringing God more to the world. Because I think we can choose, more or less, as humanity, whether or not we want a world marching towards heaven or a world marching towards hell. Not in the like afterlife concept of it, but in the world can be a really good place. The world can be a really bad place. You know, I think at the end of the day, the great promise of Christianity is that the world is going to always eventually head in this direction, because the Holy Spirit is always calling, and there's always some group listening somewhere. But obviously, different theologians have different worldviews. But that's just that. And again, Dr. King would agree with those sorts of things. And especially traditional Black churches would be very progressionist theologically, which is why he founded the Progressive Baptist Church. People think it was a political statement. It wasn't. It was about progressive theology. So that's more than you want to know, but great question. You know that's always a risk when you ask me a question. All right, any other questions about 45 that jump out at folks? This is when Joseph is making himself known to everybody, and they're all like, uh-oh, our comeuppance is here. If you're okay with that, I'm going to move to 6. Oh. Yes. Yep. Yes. I mean, even though he's a victim of that, it's so hard, right? It really is hard. Yes. Goshen, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Isolated them
Mm-hmm.
so that they would not
Mm-hmm.
some of the things that the Egyptians do focus on
Themselves. Yep.
yeah, you know, because it's whether they have appointed
Mhm. Mhm.
and so
Pure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Though you will see if we were to go into the book of Exodus, part of the reason they spend 40 years in the desert is to try to get out the stuff they picked up while they were in Egypt. To do that social spiritual work. But no, absolutely. No, good observation. Any other from 45? All right, I'm going to jump to 46. All right. God calls Jacob out of Egypt. It's worth noting. So Jacob doesn't actually hear the call from the Pharaoh or from Joseph, but hears it from God. Okay. Goshen, by the way, would have been the best agricultural area in Egypt during the ancient times. And you're right, it was absolutely isolated from a good portion of Egypt, just by the way the rivers and the delta works. Not a ton, honestly, in good old 46 there, unless that I ran into. Anything jump out to you guys? No, they look down on shepherds. Egypt is okay. So it goes back to the styles of government and the styles of economies. Okay, so if you were to look over past the Sinai Peninsula into what we know as Palestine, Israel, Jordan, that area, at this point you have mostly herds. Okay, so you basically survived by hunting, gathering, and herding. So it's sort of the first part of agriculture is just kicking online because you can still nomadically move around, hunt, gather, but keep small domesticated animals with you. Okay, and that's what we're talking. We're talking sheep and goats. Okay, and in Egypt, what you have, especially now that you have now that you founded like standing agriculture, so we have crops being planted and irrigation occurring. Okay, with irrigation and crops allow you to have a professional military, which is what the Pharaoh commands, because he can have a standing military where the other countries you essentially, if you were invaded, everyone would send a thing out to the chiefs and say, send me as many of your strong men as you could. And they say, okay, you 5 over there, I don't need you for harvest, you go fight. Okay, was sort of the way that was organized, which is obviously far less militarily viable than a standing trained army with standing trained troops. Because once you have trained troops, you can have like armor, you can have you get really good with a sword, I'll get really good with a sling, you get really good with a spear, and that's much more effective than like, what do you have on you today? I have a knife. Anyone else got a knife? All right, we have knives. It also meant in Egypt that you could then develop cities. Now, granted, what we would see as a small town, they would see as a city. Okay, so these are not millions of people. That's just not how the ancient world worked. You did not have bureaucracies big enough to deal with that, or food sources with high enough yields to produce that. But in comparison to a group of nomadic clansmen, this looks really metropolitan. And so part of the reason they don't like herdsmen is because that is sort of an inferior agricultural competition. Okay, because that would have been sort of what you did in the sort of podunk rural areas for like unsophisticated people who hadn't discovered the wonders of irrigated agriculture, which is what is giving Egypt a sort of huge advantage militarily, politically, economically over many of their neighbors at this point.
Sounds like the rest between the ranchers and
Well, and that's part of the issue is you have the same situation of your farmers are going to want your really good crop areas, and they're going to want to push the herdsmen out. Okay, especially because sheep eat all the way down to the roots. Okay, and so they want to get the sheep herders out of there, and which means they're going to try to drive the sheep herders towards the less productive lands, which generally doesn't work because usually land that is good for sheep is also good for agriculture. Someone's going to end up with a lesser land. Goshen is unique in the fact that it is very good grasslands, not particularly great agricultural lands. So it is very, very fertile insofar as if you're a herdsman. Much the way if you were to go to Nebraska, you have a huge cut that was made during the Ice Age, which is literally a giant valley where I-80 goes through most of the way all the way to a town called Kozad. Okay, you're actually in a valley if you were to look at it typologically. No, typographically. There we go. If you look at it that way, and in that area, you have really fertile soil for planting, but it is a big triangle that actually comes to a point in the little city of Kozad. And so the second you get out of there, it's really good grasslands. So you have a whole history of fights between ranchers and farmers because the farmers want the triangle and the ranchers could use everything. And so eventually the ranchers get pushed out of everything or gets pushed out to have everything that is not in the triangle. There's a whole history of that. And I served the congregation. One was primarily ranchers, one was primarily farmers. Great folks again. I had a blast. Learned more than I ever would imagine. All right. Any other 46 questions from chapter 46?
I was so Joseph was saying like when Pharaoh, they ask what you do with God. Always your family's always herding sheep. He knew that they would not have them anywhere near the rest. So
Absolutely. Get their own little place. Absolutely.
100%.
You don't do anything else. Oh, good point. Any other questions or comments, thoughts, reflections? All right, moving to 47. All right, so here, whenever I can take a shot at fundamentalists or literalists, I do, and here is another chance at that. All right, in verse 11, so everyone, I want you to actually go to verse 11 here, so 47:11. Okay, and I was just going to say it in slightly different ways, but I'm going to read you 11, okay, because we're going to take this part for a second. It said, so Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the districts of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed Joseph. Okay. And y'all should say something like that. The important thing is, does everyone say the district of Ramses? Yep. Right. You know why everyone says that? Because it's super clear in the text. It literally says the district of Ramses. There is a historically massive problem. Ramses hasn't been born, nor has he become the most famous pharaoh in all of time.
Well, you look at what it's about.
He will, in fact, not be born for 200 years. Okay? So here's the deal. What we can tell you is that at some point, probably a scribe was redoing this and realized that no one used the word Goshen anymore for a territory, right? Because we all have areas. If you were to look at old maps, you could find words. Like if I told you find Tanatuva on a map, I bet you none of you know where Tanatuva is, right? Anyone? Any takers? No. Why? Because Tanatuva hasn't existed since 1947. It's, by the way, just outside of Mongolia. The Stalinist government, after they took over the Balkans, annexed Tanatuva. No one paid attention because it was this itty-bitty little country in the middle of nowhere with no political power, and it never got its freedom. Borders toward northern Mongolia. You can Google it. And so you have a situation where you have an area that no one really calls Goshen anymore. They all call it the area of Ramses. So a scribe clearly went back at some point and stuck this note in there, which then worked its way into scripture. Okay, so for all you literalists out there, so if you're watching literalists, you explain how we have a place named after a person who hasn't been born for 200 years. Yeah, and this is why we have to approach things with a certain academic measure and a certain sort of reasoning. Now, at the end of the day, does it matter that a scribe got in here and wrote the area of Ramses? No, right? Because they're the same area. It's just a different name. Okay. But it does say, you know, people have touched this over time, and we have to be conscious of that. Okay. We see the founding of the pharaohs and the ruler of a kingdom, and sort of how it happened. Now, when I say how it happened, I'm not saying that we can literally historically prove that there was a guy named Joseph and he did all this. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. We can say, from looking at economic history and archaeological data, that the way Pharaoh eventually becomes a sort of absolute monarch is that during times of starvation, because he had a bureaucracy, because he had a standing military, and militaries are good at storing food, okay, and good at taxing, he was able to store food. And then when the 7-year cycle, which is a normal thing, still exists in Egypt, in which you have bad crop fails, he would come out there and say, if you run out of food, give me your land. I will feed you till your land produces again. When your land produces again, you give me 1/5. But it is my land to sell and buy. You now sharecrop it with me. And if you think about that sort of economic system, he could quickly gain massive areas of land. Because if your choice is starvation or sharecropping, you will pick sharecropping. It's pretty brutal though. But this is also the ancient world, and things are really brutal in the ancient world. Yeah.
He was blessed by God. He took care of his family, and he was blessed by everything. How could he not see what would happen if he? I mean, he was basically enslaved them, just like, and which I can understand the benefits and all that, but you don't see that it seems wrong.
No, it's totally wrong. Okay, so like morally, it's absolutely horrible. With that said, it's one of those things that, like, if you like, remember, this is one of the first nations the world will ever have. No one had ever really developed a nation. Yeah, you probably have a nation somewhere in China because you have some of the beginning of the dynasties. Okay. Yes, you have the nation of Babylon about the same time starting to form in Mesopotamia. Okay. Yes, you probably have some proto versions of the Persian Empire getting started, but this is pretty far from, I mean, we think of that as close, but if you're talking walking, that's pretty far. Okay. You know, you also, by the way, do probably have nations, the Mayans are probably getting started. So you have stuff going in the New World too, our Western Hemisphere. And so it's sort of like, I don't know, like, I don't disagree with you in the sense of like, it's wrong. But at the same time, it's sort of like when you have a new technology, it's hard to know the horribly bad things it might be used for. Like the guy who created TNT didn't realize he was creating artillery shells.
Well,
You know what I mean? Like,
my point, what I'm saying is that he saw that there was no chance of them ever seeing their land back. They had no chance of, there's no like escape for them.
but I don't know if he would have known that. That's all I'm
But if
questioning.
he said, okay, the Pharaoh owns the land now,
Mhm.
but he doesn't offer an option for them to buy the land back from the Pharaoh.
Right, but I mean,
So you're basically saying,
well, we don't.
not you, but
Yeah.
Joseph is saying, hey, I can do great by the Pharaoh, but he's not doing great by God.
Correct. And this is when, again, we talk about this remnant thing. So I would say that what's going on is Joseph is not being faithful. But his non-faithfulness will lead to the enslavement of the Israelite people.
Right.
Because you'll grow resentment, which is going to break down society. Because he is not seeing these Egyptians as fully human. Or he would stop himself from enslaving.
Right.
And so, again, I think to me, this is part of how history works. And so I'd say that God did not want him to slave. God never says go enslave. Okay. If anything, God has been very cautious about engaging too much in any of the Egyptian stuff. Okay. All God has done so far in this story, really, for Joseph, is help him interpret dreams so he doesn't die.
Right.
And so I would say, yes, absolutely. Joseph has done something absolutely horrible. But
So you wrestle with who he was
Mhm.
to.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah.
He was full of slavery himself,
Right.
and he ends up to be
Yeah. Huh.
so, you know, Pharaoh treated him very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
So,
only because of the dream
yeah,
that God gave him.
yeah.
So if it wasn't, I mean.
Well, I don't think
I'm
any.
just saying, it doesn't, I feel like I'm totally preaching now. But
No, you go for it. I like Bible studies because people know more than I do.
again, it's just like, oh, I owe the Pharaoh for everything. Okay, well, first off, you were sold into slavery.
Mhm.
You was thrown into prison.
Mhm.
The only reason Pharaoh even looked at it was because God said, okay, this is how you get out of this good stuff. What you do is, you tell them what's going on in your dreams. Trust me, you get it right.
Mhm.
Hey, it's gonna be great. So it's more like a tick for tack. Okay, I'll give you everything because without you, I will have nothing. And then he basically the Pharaoh in charge. The Pharaoh just kind of went, okay, you do it. He's basically Pharaoh's just Bezos, and then Joseph is everyone else making them his own way.
Yeah, that would seem true.
And maybe it's because I feel like I'm becoming more and more of a socialist or communist or whatever, but it's just, it clearly shows that it's like, dude, look where you came from.
Right?
How can you not see what you were going to do to the very people that you were once was?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's
And I'm good
amazing.
with that.
It's amazing though, right? Because if you look at history, we see people do this all the time.
Right.
You know, you have the person who makes it out of whatever, only to be like, well, you should pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Look what happened to me. Even if the way they got out was sheer dumb luck.
Right.
Okay. Or they had a 1 in a million voice, or they happened to just be in, you know, bought the right stock at the right time, or whatever, or it literally hit the lottery.
Yeah.
You know, that's one of the reasons I think for Gen Z and younger millennials, things like the Hunger Games, which I think points to that world,
Yeah.
and how that slight chance of those few people who make it out of the bad place is actually a form of social control, or can be used as a form of social control, it resonates so much with younger generations. And when I say resonates, let's understand, in Hong Kong right now, if you look at the protesters, they do this. That is a Hunger Games reference. In Myanmar, they do this. This is a Hunger Games reference. Okay. All my kiddos in confirmation, not probably right now, but a few years ago, like if you went to a ball game, you would see them do this. It's a Hunger Games reference. The 3 fingers and 1 finger down and 1 finger across. And you see the same scenario with Divergent, which was another follow-on hit with the same generational group. And you look at a lot of what has been really big for that Gen Z, younger millennial, older Gen Z group. These are the stories that they resonate with. Now we can argue good or bad, right or wrong, and I'm not here to bring moral judgment. But we see that same story playing out here with Joseph.
Right.
And I agree with you. I think there is a real problem with the fact that he basically turns his back on everybody else. And maybe is a caution for us to be wary of that instinct.
But it seems like throughout the Bible, God doesn't use very good people, you know.
At the same time, like people are awful. Like, I don't mean that to insult anybody, but like if you don't believe me, work customer service in any industry for like a day, and like these people who otherwise you would hope are perfectly nice humans, when they have the power and they have the advantage, and all they have to do is say, I want to see your manager, they do it, right? Okay, right. I mean, you can testify, and you sit there being like, oh my goodness. You know, I mean, one of my sisters my sister Allison is a union rep for her teachers union. Okay. And she's taught for years and years and years. And I mean, they asked her to be a union rep. She's like, sure, I'll give it a shot for a while. And she loves it. But she'll say, like, parents are crazy. Like, oh my goodness. Like the stories she hears from the teachers are like, I gave him an F because he turned in nothing. Like he wrote his name on the paper and then, drew a giant X through everything. So he got a 0. So you don't get points. And the parents come in, how dare you, like it's a blank sheet of paper. What grade did you think he was going to get? Absolutely. One of my brother-in-laws and his wife, they are sort of adjunct visiting associate, however many things you can put in front of their name to indicate that they are nobodies at the university. They have all those titles. But the things that they get, like, because they'll get parents calling up, my son cannot make your 8:30 class, you should have a class just for him. No. Well, why can't he make the 8:30 class? Well, he sleeps in. Well, right? But okay, you're a manager, okay? And you've been a manager at multiple places, right? Okay. I bet you had employees that did not understand that, like, if the shift started at 1, they should be there, by 1.
Oh, yeah. And they get funding for it, and then they're like, early. And they even give, like, Walmart and Festival give, like, a leeway. Faster. Your starting time, if you get like a little bit of a leeway, and people still look at it as like a
No, I mean, it's just people, like, yeah, like, every so often people are like, oh, everyone's good, and I'm like, have you met people? Have you never met, like, everyone's wonderful and good? I'm like, this is not how this works. No, I had a good friend whose sister for a very long time was a manager at McDonald's, and she was just like, she would tell people, like, seriously, if you just show up and don't, like, set something on fire and, like, do your job and then, like, go home and show up again, like, you stick around for 6 or 7 months, you'll start getting promotions. Like, we'll teach you how to do each thing at McDonald's. Like, no, people. So my answer is yes, these guys are horrible. I honestly think humanity has gotten better over time. So this was a worse pool as general that they're pulling from. With that said, humanity's always struggling. It's one of the reasons we all need Christ. Because we all struggle. And I bet you all of us have at least one person in our life that hates us, that if we were to interview them and have them make a documentary about who we are, we'd all look horrible. We have at least one person out there. We probably have more than one person out there. I feel like I'm getting too close to home here. All right, moving on to chapter 48. All right, so here we go. Chapter 48. In case you were thinking these people were too good, what do we do again? We have this stupid little blessing. Remember, we've had this blessing every generation. We have this blessing in every generation. This darn blessing has gone sideways. And we're back to trying to bless the younger son over the older son. So the older son will have to bow to the younger son, and the older son does not want to. And goodness, I bet you that's going to create some conflict. Okay. I think there's a lesson for us in here. And one of the things before I got to this church, one of the things I did was I was really good at working with churches in conflict. And I will be really honest, having worked with churches that were in conflict, like churches that were just bonkers and had real issues or had real challenges, and they weren't all bonkers. That isn't quite fair. I should say they always had some sort of major issue. Okay. The thing that I observed working with them was that generally the people in the room wanted the church to succeed. And generally the people in the room had learned to tolerate things they shouldn't. Okay. And these cycles of just bad decision making, whether or not they're financial bad decision making, or how we treated people bad decision making, or how we made bad decisions bad decision making, often you'd have these moments where you'd have a belief, a ritual, an idea, a concept that sounded really good, but it really wasn't. And it was one of those things you couldn't say in a room of people because they'd all look at you and say, you are horrible for not thinking this is amazing. And it is in that thing where you have a problem. So one of the things I used to always tell people, one of the big things little churches have trouble with is they will say, I want to be a family. I want everyone to know my name. I want this to be Cheers. Okay, I walk in, they all know my name. I'm a little family. I am tight knit. Isn't that what Christianity should be? And that sounds great, right? Who does not want that? Problem. Who wants to be the in-law? Very few people go on vacation and say, you know what, honey, you stay here. I'll go hang out with your parents. Because that sounds like 2 weeks of vacation. Now, there are people who are really close with their in-laws, and I always say, especially, that I did actually do that. I spent a year with my in-laws voluntarily, and it was wonderful, in case you're watching. I will tell you that story. They can totally hear what I'm saying. No. Thank you, Paul and Lynn. But for most people who are not me, no, most people, that does not sound like a vacation, right? And so one of the things like small churches, part of the thing you often have to show people is, yes, you all know each other, you all love each other, but if you're ever going to grow, you have to have a way to bring people into the family. Because if they aren't part of the family, and if the family just sort of makes the decisions the way they do, they're going to be a perpetual in-law, and no one wants to have Thanksgiving be every day. Because we all know that our spouse, no matter how much we love them, their family does it differently than ours did, and that is hard to adjust to. And that's true for me too, right? And that's one of the things I counsel couples on is like, you, sir, need to deal with your family when your family gets mad about something she did, because they are your family. You, ma'am, need to deal with your family when they get mad about something he did, because he's going to be at a disadvantage because he's not going to know all the secret codes and all the secret rules and all the ways in which you do things as a fill-in surname. Okay. And you find this in these conflicted churches, is you have something that either sounds good or maybe is good, that then gets turned just enough to become a constant problem. And I would say this darn blessing is what is causing this never-ending generational combat between all the siblings. Because why in the world? Why don't you stop the blessing? We'd stop the blessing when we got into Cain and Abel. If we decided after one brother tried to murder the other one, that maybe we shouldn't go blessing people anymore. You know how much better the rest of Genesis would have been? At the same time, it would have been like, why can't I bless it? What harm could come with blessing? I mean, how could you be the person who's against blessing children? Right?
Did they explain why?
In this case, they don't. They don't really explain why. I mean, this is a giant prayer. In fact, it is the longest prayer in the entire Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's like, way to go, Jacob, and being long-winded. So just a note that sometimes, especially if you have an intractable problem where you're sitting down going, I do not understand why this is not working. Okay. The first thing you got to do is stop looking for all the bad things, because the instinct is we're going to look for that thing that is broken and we're going to fix that. And again, if you're talking churches or clubs, usually if the problem is something that is broken that needs to fix, and it's obviously broken, it isn't hard to fix. Because everyone will be like, oh yeah, we really should stop doing that. That is a problem. We should fix that. If you can't fix it over a period of time, what you got to do is stop and look at all the things you think are working. And ask yourself, is any of these things that are working not actually working? And that is hard work to do. And communities and councils and stuff do not enjoy doing that unless they have to. But we as Christians should always ask that question. Because it's when we think things are working and they are not, that things get really bad, especially for those it's not working for. You know? Oh, absolutely. This is not how we do this here. Well, yep. And now I will tell you, one of the most controversial things I ever did as a pastor is I was working on doing renewal in Bertramp. And we had sort of gotten to this weird crossroads where we had run into sort of a block of folks who are saying, yeah, we're not making any more reforms. We're tired. We've done a lot of work. And it was true. They had done a lot of work. And we had moved way forward on a lot of things, but they had more things to do. And so I decided that what we do for Lent was we were going to completely throw out our entire way we do Lent services. Okay, now both communities, this is the Oaked Parish, we're full of folks who had been involved in sports. And so these folks are naturally competitive. And farmers, by the way, are naturally competitive folks. Okay. And so as part of church, we played a game every Wednesday because we had Lenten services and every Sunday. And in the game, if you were a member of the church, you were assigned to a team, whether or not you knew it or not. So if you showed up and you're like, what's going on week 3? I'll be like, what's your name again? Okay, you're on team 5. Team 5, raise your hand, new member. Okay. And what you played was the future of the church. You were a pretend council. I created an entire, basically video game or board game in which you had random chance of good years and bad years, for giving, for membership, all that based off of historical data. And then you made decisions with the basic goal of the game of, if you don't decide to do something, and it was box, you could do anything. So think I'm basically game master. You could come up with anything you wanted to do, and I would try to find a mathematical way to give you odds of whether or not that would work or not, based off of actual historical data for other churches who had tried whatever. Whether or not you're raising money or trying to bring in new members or trying to engage the community or whatever. What would be a reasonable expectation? And man, I'll tell you, there were people who loved it. And there were people who were like, this is the worst thing you've ever done to a human being. We rolled dice as part of the thing, as part of service, because you would get one of the youth would come and roll a die, and that would determine basically it was a good year, it was a bad year, based off of best or worst years in the past. Oh, I have people bring that up to me. Oh, I'll tell you, the youth were all into getting to be the dice rollers in the middle of a church. Okay, my confirmands were all on top of that. They were lined up to volunteer to do that. We had some of the best attendance ever, those Lenten services, man. With that said, we had 12 teams. By the time we got to Easter, I told them I'd stop when we got to Holy Week. So we got to Palm Sunday, was over, game done. So by the time we got to Palm Sunday, one team had to close the church. Man, those people were mad at me. Most of the teams had to make some sort of major decision, because most of them for the first few weeks just were like, oh, I'm not going to do anything. I'm like, okay, I'll give you your next sheet after a year of not doing anything. And then 3 churches really did really well. They had really innovative ideas that they came up with. of what they could do as mission to the community to move forward. One of those ideas got enacted in real life after I left. So I say that because part of what we do as Christians is walk into those dark places and ask those big questions, even if they're hard. Because when we do, and this is true in your personal life, this is true in communal life, this isn't just true for churches. If you're in any organization, this is true. When you go through and you do that work, you will be better for it at the end of the day. But it is so easy to sort of hide in the sort of fantasies we want to hide in. Whether or not it's the nostalgia of a time long ago or the romanticism of an ideal world in the future. But we as Christians are about saying, this is what the past was, we need to be honest. This is about the present, we need to be honest. What, with God's help, can we do in the future? We need to be honest. And then try to walk as faithfully as possible into that with the knowledge that we're going to get it wrong. But that's why God loves us anyways. And why we have grace and mercy and compassion. Because goodness knows these people got it wrong more than we will. So there's my sermon. Sorry. It's a danger of having a pastor lead a Bible study is I have a tendency to sermons. All right, moving to 49, if that's okay with everybody. 49 is the longest blessing in the Old Testament. I misspoke. I have nothing interesting to say about this. I tried really hard to find something interesting to say about 49. I got nothing. It's old. It's long. It's very, very long.
Why is it called a blessing? If in chapter verse 5, it says, Simeon and Levi are so excited. Dear man, why not they didn't touch this? Oh my soul, stay away from them. May they never be afraid of the right place. What kind of blessing is that?
Right? Again, back to my... Right? Well, no, and that's what I mean is like, well, he literally says in 7, cursed be the anger, so fierce with their fury, so cruel. I will scatter them to Jacob and disperse them in Israel. Like, thanks, thanks, Grandpa. What? No. Israel. Jacob's name is Israel. So, okay, so it's worth noting. Well, I mean, he's been promised that that the kingdom of Israel will exist.
Okay. Oh.
So he's been promised your people will found. Okay. Plus, we probably have some rewriting going backwards. We can't prove it, but.
The same idea. I'm thinking of a blessing,
Right. Yes.
More like he's prophesying what was happening to each of those.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I thought so.
Well, and it's worth it's all the other thing worth noting is with each one of these, the darn blessings are getting longer and less happy. So if you like looked back at the last time there was a blessing, again, back to my, maybe the dysfunction is that we like this weird blessing ritual. Maybe we should stop that. Try that for a few generations. See how that works.
That's all I need to see with Reuben and Simeon and Levi, who were the
Yeah.
They really got done, all the things that they had done.
Mm-hmm.
Like and what they had done, seeking vengeance for
Mhm.
their sister. So they lost their high standing.
Yeah.
I say.
So it's interesting. The answer is I don't really know. I mean,
Is the tribe of Judah the strongest tribe? It says your brother shall praise you. Stretches out like a lion. Stronger tribe?
no,
Those
he's.
are tribes, not the
Yeah. I'd have to go back and look. The answer is I don't quite know. I don't. My instinct is to say no. I don't think they are because I thought they were grabbed. Because I thought they ended up being the Northern Kingdom, which gets dispersed before the Southern Kingdom. But I could be wrong on that. So I will have to look that up. Good question. I knew you were going to ask me something like that. I don't know. I would have to look that one up. But know that I'm honest to say I really don't know.
Jesus came from
Yes. I think so. I think that's right.
Family tree.
Yes, he is. I have a note here in my, he is.
So that was a story of travel. I'm thinking of-
That sounds right.
Oh, that is, no, this one says it.
Yeah, there should be a snake.
I trust in your salvation, Lord. What? Huh?
Oh, hold on, here we go. Tribes of Israel. Okay, I have a little graphic in my Bible. This is why I really like the study Bible. Good old mentor of mine gave this to me. Said it'd be useful. He was very right. Okay. So Jacob, also known as Israel, you have father of the tribes of Israel, which is Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Ishkar, and Zalab. And then you also have, those are all from Leah. Then you have Gad, Asher, Dan, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin, which are from different wives. So Zilpah, Bilhah, and Rachel. That does not help us at all. I thought that was going to be more helpful. Never mind. I don't know. I'm not sure any of the tribes quote exist. I don't know. I will have to do some research on that. You got me good on that one. I don't know the current status of the tribes because I'm not sure Judaism would point and still say I'm this tribe or that tribe because I don't think they could. Like that would be really hard.
So this are going to be the tribes of Israel?
Isaac to Jacob, and then Jacob with Leah creates most of the tribes, but also Zilpah, Bilhah, and Rachel. So they come through Jacob. They don't come through Esau. The Levi will become a head of the Levites, I believe, the Levite tribe, which is the priestly tribe. And the priestly tribe will never actually own land, which is part of what is being said in here too. Because Levi is not left any land. And then that will be Deuteronomistic and Levitical law that the priestly tribe, Levites, do what they do in upkeep of the temple. In return for what they do, they are given these sacrifices. That's why you have all these animal sacrifices, how you feed the Levites, okay? But in turn, so the Levites don't ever gain power as sort of a theocratic movement, they cannot own land. So they are complete, they have a lot of political power, but they're also completely dependent on people going to the temple. No one goes to the temple, Levites don't eat. All right, we ready to go to 50? All right. So sort of sad, right? So 50 I found really sad because A, everyone dies, but B, the brothers still don't trust that Joseph forgave them after all that time. Because when dad dies, the brothers are like, uh-oh, he's going to surely get rid of us now. And so it ends up being this sort of open-ended, like he doesn't kill him, but it's sort of this open-ended broken relationship because his brothers, even all the way to their dad's death, do not believe that Joseph is not going to get vengeance. But it seems to imply that he doesn't. He really doesn't. Which is a step forward, right? Because if you went back to earlier stories, right, Laban was all about vengeance. You have all these people who were like, yes, I want vengeance, I will kill my brother. So we do have some improvement going on because Joseph really does forgive them for a really heinous act, and does seem to legitimately want relationship. But the hard part of that is they don't trust it. And I'll be honest, like doing counseling with couples, I have seen that. Like let's say the man has an affair, horribly hurts the woman. Woman decides, you know what, I want to stay. I want to see this. I want to see if we can make this work. Okay. I have then seen more than once the guy gets so paranoid by the idea that she would actually forgive him that he ends up leaving her over the affair he had. because he's absolutely convinced that she's going to go have an affair, or that she doesn't really mean it, or at some point she's going to get him back somehow, and then just can't live with that stress and leaves. Which from the outside looks bizarre, because you're like, dude, you were the one who did it wrong, who did the wrong. She forgave you and you left. What? But that sort of inability to accept the forgiveness can break relationship just as much as the inability to give forgiveness. And it is often just as hard to truly accept the forgiveness as it is to give it. So just one little note there. And then the other note that I thought was important is everyone's going back and getting buried in the old family plot. So there is this deep connection back to the family, even though it's totally dysfunctional. Except for who?
Joseph.
Doesn't he go back?
Right, so Joseph died after the 700, and they involved him in his life.
Oh, in Egypt, yes. So so dad goes back, but he then founds himself there. You're right, I missed that. Good catch. So my bad, scratch what I just said.
But I think I read somewhere that when they leave, I think.
Did they take him?
I think they take. I think they take. But he does say so it makes it swear that.
Yeah, okay, maybe that's what but you're right, I missed that. Places coffin in Egypt. So he tells his brothers, take me back to where dad is. He dies, and they're like, yeah, no. That's interesting. I missed that. Way to go, guys. Good catch.
But that's the idea. That's where it's really on itself.
I'm sorry, what?
Oh, yeah.
Huh. Right. I don't know.
That was, I noticed, they did that. I wasn't sure if they did.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. That's a good question.
Also, what do you expect?
Yeah.
And so they were doing it like these, like, hard to find.
Might have put them in.
Right.
Yeah.
But I know what you're talking about. There was a big rule they thought they found Jesus' women. And what was what? It was that guy who did Avatar. The blue guy.
I know what Avatar is, but I'm blanking on who made it.
Yeah. He was trying to make the big rule trying the exposure. And he was supposed to was the name. He never got really named. Yeah.
That was the idea of joining my ancestors.
Mhm.
Okay.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm gonna go ahead and just say goodbye in the sense of, for those who are watching the recording, I'm gonna stop the recording if that's cool with everybody, because we are a little past our normal time, but we knew that because we're taking on an extra chapter tonight. You guys don't have to leave. You don't have to leave, Gail. I'm just turning off the recording, so I always like to say bye to anyone who is watching the recording. Thank you so much for joining us. Keep your eyes out if you've enjoyed this, to go ahead and also look for more adult ed opportunities, particularly come this fall. All right, now I'm gonna stop the recording.